In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
So our definition of leadership is that leadership is about making others better, first as a result of our presence, and then in such a way that it lasts into our absence. So we think that there are three really important words there: others, presence, absence. And the first mistake we've already talked about, which is that leaders can make it about them. The making others, once you get that, we usually realize, okay, we're going to make people better as a result of our presence. And then we mistakenly think it's okay if after we leave, things fall apart. In fact, we might even get a little bit of an ego boost because, I was statistically significant. When I was there, it went up, and when I wasn't there, it went down. And we're really trying to disabuse that idea, and that our job when we are there is to prepare people for when we're gone. And that the true testament to leadership is how well people do when we're not in the room.
I'm Aga Bayer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabayer.com/podcast. Hey, this is Aga. Welcome to episode 69 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by the Culture Strategy Bootcamp, a virtual bootcamp that helps you create a thriving culture at scale. So if you are a leader in a company that grows, and if you want to start turning your strategy and your culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth, definitely check this out. Actually, this week we are launching the first bootcamp for founders and leaders who will be working on strengthening their culture building and strategy shaping muscles over a course of 100 days. And if you'd like to be next, type this into your browser: bit.ly/culture-bootcamp. That's bit.ly/culture-bootcamp. Now, I'm not sure if you've noticed, but we've been on a bit of a hiatus for reasons I'm not going to get into right now. But here is what I've been reminded in the process. I really freaking love working on the show. So now it's time to introduce you to my guests today, Frei and Anne Morris. Frances is a professor of technology and operations management at Harvard Business School, and her wife, Anne Morris, is the executive founder of the Leadership Consortium. They both supported companies like Uber, WeWork and Riot Games with their culture change, and they wrote a wonderful new book on leadership called Unleashed, the Unapologetic Leader's Guide to Empowering Everyone Around You. I don't want to prolong the intro, so I will just say this. We've been producing this show for more than 4 years now. And if there's one thing that we've learned, it's that when our guests and I have fun recording the show, you enjoy it a great deal too. So if you throw in a ton of brilliance and actionable insights into the mix, we have an instant hit. So get ready to be blown away. There are tons of laughter, joy, and practical wisdom in this episode. So without further ado, here is Frei and Anne Morris.
Hi, my name is Frei. I'm a professor at the Harvard Business School, and I try to help individuals and organizations overcome obstacles to excellence.
Welcome, Frances. And hello, Anne.
So efficient. I love it. My name is Anne Morris. I am wife of Frances.
and wife of Anne.
I think probably the simplest identity for me is entrepreneur and writer, which are the two things I think most about. But I also spend quite a bit of time coaching entrepreneurs and leaders who are trying to take a swing at big change in their organizations. And Francis and I do a lot of work together for organizations, helping them achieve excellence.
We do all of our most important work together.
This is awesome. And I'm so excited to have a duo like you on the show, because usually we just do one-to-one, and it's so exciting to have a couple.
So predictable. A single guest, it's just so predictable.
Exactly. This is going to be probably completely unpredictable and also really, really different. And so I'm excited to do this with you, and also super curious about what it's like to be working with your spouse. Because I won't lie, I've been flirting with this idea of working with my husband, but I'm very hesitant. So this is a conversation to be had.
We're very pro.
Yes. And you can turn off the recording if that would be helpful to you at any time. Yes. But delighted to talk about it.
We're very pro, and we can give you some tips to the extent that they're helpful.
I would love some tips. Okay, so we'll definitely get there. And I'm even suspecting that probably for a lot of our listeners, this might be quite useful as well. Because a large portion of our listeners are entrepreneurs, and there are various types of partnerships happening, but obviously partnerships with family members as well. So we definitely have a lot to learn from you. So, but before we go there, I want to ask a question that I ask all our guests at the very beginning. And the question is about the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person. So, take turns, but I'm curious, how did you grow up and what impact it had on who you are today?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And I think particularly for entrepreneurs, so important to reflect on those early influences and assumptions, because we bring them into organizations without realizing it. And in small organizations, they have an outsized impact. So I guess I'll start with family, which is where I think it probably begins for all of us. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the heart of the Midwest. I was raised by a single mom. Lost my father at a very young age. She was an entrepreneur in her own way in real estate. And I think probably what was most useful about family culture to me looking back is, I think, both by design, because of the way she parented, but also because I had a number of siblings, and there wasn't a lot of room for super hands-on parental involvement. There was a lot of room to experiment, and failure was okay, and it was okay to be myself. And those were really powerful lessons to learn at a young age. I think the other major influences on me were probably team sports. I think the metaphor of coach as leader, where your job is to set the conditions for success, but you're fundamentally on the sidelines while other people perform. I think that was a really powerful early lesson for me. I also spent early part of my career doing public health work in rural Latin America, where I had to set individuals and volunteers up for success with very little room to communicate with them. And I think that's also where this idea of absence leadership that we develop in our book, where culture is really one of your main levers. That was one place that I had to learn that the hard way. And finally, and I'll shut up and let my wife.
I love it.
She's learning about you now.
I think my early experiences with entrepreneurship, I started a company in the biotech space here in Boston. And I learned early on that you can't really tell smart, creative scientists what to do, which was very frustrating to our board of directors. But you can really only give them cultural North Stars. So one of ours, for example, was that our mandate as an organization was about impact, not first, and kind of scientific breakthrough second, which was a new way of thinking for a lot of our scientists. But it was really about applying the science and making it useful to the world. not just making discoveries and adding to their publication resume. So I think figuring out how to influence very smart, very creative people without having traditional tools of command and control, I think really, really shaped the way I thought about leadership.
That's beautiful.
Beautiful, so fascinating and so interesting to learn all of that. And definitely I want to unpack a few things that you've mentioned. But before that, I definitely want to hear from Frances as well.
Sure. And so I'll use a similar scaffolding. So family, I'm the youngest of 6. My mom was 25 when she had me. So we were all very we were all very near in age. Anne and I are both the youngest, which I think probably helps us a lot. Got a couple of quirks, but because there's some invisibility that happens when you're the youngest, which was totally liberating. So that was the sort of the highlight. The low light of it is that I felt like I didn't receive a lot of the memos that everyone else received on what to do and how to do it. I now, in my adult life, I refer to these as the secret memos. But since I was not given them growing up, I have made it a mission to provide them to others anywhere I can.
Right.
That's the family side.
What were some of them? Can you throw in just one, two?
Yeah, I'll throw in one that's, I don't know if this is going to help your readers or not, but so I'm 4 girls, 2 boys. I'm the youngest. It was a complete surprise to me when the first time that time of the month came around. That just seems like a secret memo I should have received.
Yeah.
I got a mom, 3 sisters, all within,
you should have
I should have gotten that one. So I could give others, but I think that one really,
right.
That one really does it.
Yeah.
So I think family there, sports as well.
Huge influence for you.
Yeah, huge influence for me. I ended up playing basketball in college, but played sports throughout my life. Was really known as someone who loved sports, happened to also be good at math. But sports was the driving force to me. Even as I went and got my PhD, I thought I was going to go be a coach, a basketball coach.
Academia was really your fallback career.
With certainty, academia was my fallback career. And I'm a coach in academia, so it has all worked out.
That's amazing.
On that part. And then I guess the last part is, as I reflect back, I can remember going down the hill. I grew up in a very small town and padding down the hill in 7th grade. And there was a little country store there. And I went in and I asked if I could work from opening until noon on the days that we didn't have school. And so I did my first negotiation. And I negotiated for $1.25 an hour. So in the summer, I would work like 16 hours a week and I'd get a $20 bill.
The legality of child labor on Long Island.
And so I realized then I'm super good at negotiating for others and not great at negotiating for myself. So that was the last negotiation I did for myself.
Now you have others doing it for you. That's a good strategy.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I love it. And there's so much I would like to dive a little bit deeper into. And first of all, I just want to say we have one thing in common in that, I'm not a basketball coach, but I used to play basketball as well.
Nice.
And my dad was actually the coach of the team. And this was actually the beginning of my journey with culture because my dad had this thing called his playbook. And he would clip in all the game plans into the playbook. But he also had like 2 first pages laminated. And I was always curious about what it was. And he said, well, this is my coaching philosophy and some of the principles that I want my team to keep in mind when they play and generally in how they approach this game. And today, I guess we would talk about those things as values. And so it was so interesting to see that he had those things that were never changing.
We love laminated. We love laminated.
Right? Isn't it amazing?
It's such confidence.
Yeah. I think it took him some time before he laminated them because he did iterate. But eventually, yes, he was confident enough to laminate those pages. It was so funny. And recently I spoke to him, just wanted to get it right. And he said, listen, I don't have the laminated version anymore. It's just so outdated. So I have everything digitized now. So he's 80 years old, by the way. But yeah, it's been digitized. Oh my goodness. Amazing background and such interesting stories. Thanks for sharing this. And I want to talk obviously about your book and also pick up some of the themes that you've mentioned, but let's start with the book. So you've done a lot of things together, as you said. One of those things that you've done together is an amazing book called Unleashed, the Unapologetic Leader's Guide to Empowering Everyone Around You. And I loved it. I would definitely recommend everyone who listens to this show to get the book and read it. And this is how you open the first chapter. You say, there are a lot of books about leadership, many of them terrific, and humans have been dwelling on the practice and mystery of great leadership for millennia. So why read one more? And so I want to turn the tables on you and ask, why write one more?
I'd say that it's, and Anne and I were just looking at each other, one being polite, letting you go first. No, you go first. So I won.
Congrats. Well done.
Because what we were observing in practice of the leaders who would win, and we are ridiculously competitive. Another double click we can go through, but ridiculously competitive. And so we like to help individuals and organizations win. And the leaders we saw that were leading organizations to win did not have their central tendency in what we were reading in the book. So the books was teaching leaders how to be more leaderly and getting leaders to focus more on themselves and understand their weaknesses and really dwell on themselves. But in practice, we found just the opposite, that the leaders who were purposely not dwelling on themselves and putting all of their energy on others, they were the ones that were winning. And so we thought it was worthwhile for us to share our observations in the context of what had also been written about leadership.
In practice, the pattern we observed in organizations is that leaders, and some of these pressures are very recent. Some of it's social media and the stakes of getting things wrong and leading in public have all, slowly and sometimes dramatically gone up over the last decade. But all of these pressures were leading leaders to turn inward at precisely the moment when the challenges of leadership were getting more complex and required more and more that they turn outward. And a metaphor we like to use is, it's stop looking at the mirror and start looking out the window. And so we wrote the book really as a letter to practitioners who are really in the ring building companies and changing companies and trying to have impact at the scale of organizations and beyond. And it was everything we had learned in the last 20 years of trying to do all of those things ourselves.
Yeah. And I so completely resonate with that, because this has been my observation as well, not just in reviewing literature and what has been available out there for leaders to read, but also in what people do when they face a difficult situation, which is, as you say, this tendency to have this inward focus and try to figure out how do I make this right, and putting a lot of pressure on ourselves as leaders rather than thinking how can I enable others to figure things out and drive us forward. And I have to say, I love and admire the simplicity and clarity of Unleashed. For me, I can tell that it's a result of many years of reflection and work and experimenting with these ideas. And I also love how you structured the whole book, because it basically consists of two parts, presence and absence, which is so, so elegant. And, writing my second book right now, I really notice those things as you would. I mean, trying to figure out what others are doing that I really admire. And I was blown away by that. So really amazing. And presence and absence are linked to your brilliant definition of leadership. So first of all, do you want to share it with our listeners, how you define leadership? Because I think it's really probably one of my favorite ones, alongside John Quincy Adams, who said, if your actions inspire others to dream more, learn more, do more, and become more, you are a leader. But I think yours might be even better. So
Well, it's related. So Anne's middle name is Adams, descended from
Uncle John.
so the apple didn't fall very far from the tree. So our definition of leadership is that leadership is about making others better, first as a result of our presence, and then in such a way that it lasts into our absence. So we think that there are three really important words there: others, presence, absence. And the first mistake we've already talked about, which is that leaders can make it about them.
Mhm.
The making others, once you get that, we usually realize, okay, we're going to make people better as a result of our presence. And then we mistakenly think it's okay if after we leave, things fall apart. In fact, we might even get a little bit of an ego boost because, I was statistically significant. When I was
Yeah.
there, it went up, and when I wasn't there, it went down. And we're really trying to disabuse that idea, and that our job when we are there is to prepare people for when we're gone. And that the true testament to leadership is how well people do when we're not in the room. And gone could be on to the next job. It could be went home for the evening. It could be away for the weekend. It could be left the company altogether. There's a lot of gone. And Anne often points out that for large companies, the CEO may never meet some of the employees in the company. So is mostly in the absence, or during this pandemic, we're mostly in the absence of people. And so how can we lead in a way that people thrive in our absence? It's an additional set of skills, and we wanted to provide the secret memos on how to thrive in that context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful. And I think it would be super useful for our listeners if you could elaborate a little bit, maybe give us a couple of ideas of what to do, first of all, to enable people to thrive in our presence. So what should we be paying attention to? What are the priorities to focus on?
Yeah, in the book we start with trust, which really we couldn't feel more strongly that it is the foundation of leadership. So building trust with the people around you, and being super aware of when that trust falters, and addressing it in a timely way. So we spend quite a bit of time in the book going through the pitfalls and where trust can break down. But it is step one for sure on the leadership ladder.
With a super practical how-to in how to build it and how to rebuild it, like super practical.
Yeah. Yes. And so, when the way we think about trust, which again goes back millennia to the way Aristotle thought about it, is that trust requires three things in a relationship. It requires logic. We have to believe that you know where you're leading us, and that it makes sense. It requires authenticity. We have to believe that we are seeing the real you and your true motivations, and you're telling us the truth. And it also requires empathy. We have to really believe that you are not just in it for yourself, but you're also in it for our well-being. And if you just look, take this crisis that we're all living through, and if you look at the leaders who are really, really succeeding in this moment. First of all, most of them happen to be women, as an aside. But if you break down why they're effective through the lens of trust and through the lens of logic, authenticity, and empathy, you can really see how essential trust is to creating the context for you to have impact, but also to enable other people to have their own impact, which is really the superpower of leadership.
And the flip side to what Anne didn't say there is that you can also see the leaders who are not thriving in this context. You can pretty quickly get, is it all about them? Do they have a plan, but it's a very secret plan, or a plan that is self-contradicting? And are you really questioning who they are in this moment, and whether or not they're telling you the truth?
Yes, absolutely. And Oh my goodness, I agree 100% with what you have just said, and I've been thinking about examples that have inspired me in these past days. And actually, it was a woman leader, and out of all people, Angela Merkel actually, when she said basically we're canceling Christmas this year in Germany because they had to introduce very strict lockdown, and the way she communicated it was so authentic and so honest and so logical that to me, it was completely irresistible. This was the best message during the pandemic that I have ever heard. And the only thing that she said was, from the bottom of my heart, I am sorry. But if we're losing 500 people per day, this is not acceptable. That was it.
Yeah.
That's what she said.
Yeah.
And it was so, so powerful.
So powerful. And I mean, as your listeners, I'm sure know, Germany is a country that really loves Christmas.
Yeah, exactly.
It's used to buy things here in America, and it lasts about 48 hours. But in Christmas, in Germany, it's a whole season.
Huge.
And so for her to stand up and say what she said, you just gave me, I just felt it in my bones there. And it was incredibly powerful and a great example. And her ability to build trust, I think, is truly exceptional.
Legendary.
Mm-hmm.
Legendary, really. You were in the first part of Presence Leadership Trust.
You're making me do the work here? Yeah. Trust is the starting point. But when we talk about presence, we also talk about the mechanics of setting another person up to succeed, and the context of setting high standards and revealing deep devotion. And here's the trick: at the same time. So usually our human nature is to default to one to the exclusion of the other, either revealing devotion or setting high standards. And the pattern there is also super clear, that the leaders who succeed really in this task of enabling others create they start with trust, but then they create a context very deliberately where others can excel.
We call that love.
We call it love. I so appreciate you're using the word elegant. That's how we saw the framework. It can read as deceptively simple, but this is our definition of love in the workplace, for sure.
So I definitely want to talk about this because I personally struggled with the word love in my work and in the business context for years. And just this year, for the first time, I decided to integrate it into one of the frameworks that I work with, which is called LIFT, and L stands for love.
Wonderful.
But it is a difficult word to introduce into the business context. So I'm curious, how did that word emerge for you? And did you have a little bit of back and forth? Should we be talking about love or not? And how will people perceive it? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. We started out calling it tough love to kind of get at this simultaneous idea. But it really, in our conversations, again, with practitioners, and we, at the time, we were spending a lot of time in tech companies. It really emerged for us in those dialogues that this is the highest form of love. And let's just own it. I think we were hesitant about the word. And then as we started using it with leaders and many of them founders and entrepreneurs for whom their organizations were a true extension of who they are as people, and the way they feel about their employees is a form of love. The way they feel about their customers is a form of love when they're getting it right. And we wanted to capture the real power of those values.
I think the other part is that we feel like setting people up for the long term, like setting them up not just for today, but for the long term, is an act of love, because you could make someone feel better today, or you could set them up so that they'll perform better in the future. This is the case when you have a lot of devotion, but you maybe insidiously lower the standards on someone. And it feels like you're doing them a favor in the short term, but you're definitely making them worse off in the long term. And so I think that part also is that love is not is not an immediate gratification. It's actually a signal that you're preparing someone to thrive in your absence. So, but we got there. Anne is the writer between the two of us. I went to math camp. I don't think Anne was considering whether or not to go to math camp when she was growing up.
Yeah, only when I was forced to go.
I instead loved going to math camp in high school. And I forgot now what I was going to say.
What you made me think about too is, I think our the natural tendency for both of us as parents is to lower the standards in the name of our devotion to our children. Mm-hmm. So I think it also allowed us to hold ourselves accountable, right? In forcing us up into the right, and what in the quadrant we call justice. It is another substitute for the word love in this context.
And devotion is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Standards are necessary, but not sufficient.
Yeah. So let's bring this to life for people who listen to this. So could you give us some examples of leaders that you've worked with who really manifested that value and practice of love in the workplace? What did it look like? What did they do? And what impact it had on the people around them?
Yeah, I'll start with one, maybe my favorite one. His name is Carlos Rodriguez Pastor. He's the head of a large company in Peru. CRP is what he goes by. And he started with a retail bank serving the emerging middle class, and then he extended into home goods for the emerging middle class and movie theater, and just kept going. And so he now serves the emerging middle class in many ways. And he believes more than anyone I have ever seen that people are his most important asset. So I'll give you one example of what he routinely does. I've been going down to Peru for about 10 years to teach the executives in the organization. And I've taught every executive over the last 10 years. And it was super common for people who were in the interview process to attend the class that we would teach down there.
Wow.
And Carlos attended every class and took notes. I have never seen a CEO do this before. Wow. And it was to take notes to learn, but it was also, people were like, it was high standards because it's there too. But it was deep devotion. He would learn so much about people, and then he could customize their development plans. And so and he signaled this in the interview process, like, here is a differentiator for our organization, our commitment to education, and I'm walking the talk. So he, to me, is the greatest example of a leader that is in justice, in the justice quadrant, high standards and deep devotion, the vast majority of time.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'll add two more to the mix here. One CEO who inspires us a lot is Lisa Su, who's the first female CEO of a semiconductor company. She's the CEO of AMD and has led an astonishing turnaround. I mean, if you just look at stock price as a measure of performance, which I know is imperfect, but there's just no ambiguity about her impact as a leader. She, part of her success was creating this culture of relentless improvement.
Yeah.
And one of the artifacts, and we can get to this word artifact later, which we have stolen from Edgar Schein, one of the original culture scholars, but one of the artifacts of that is something at AMD that they call the 5% rule, which is a commitment to get a little bit better at a task every single time the company performs it, right? But what I love about the 5% is it's not this absurd, 50%. But it's not comfort with the status quo.
It's definitely not comfort with the status quo.
So it reflects an awareness of how hard this is, but also an unwillingness to lower the standards.
And the relentlessness is just delicious.
And I'll give you one more example, which is Fred Smith, who was the founder of FedEx. And I'll give you an example from the early chapters of FedEx where the company was really struggling. So this was a moment when, and people forget this because now the company is this astonishing success, but the company was really struggling for many, many, many years. And Fred kept swinging. I mean, he actually took some of the company capital and went to Las Vegas and somehow translated his winning. We do not recommend, just a quick PSA, this is really not a good idea. And again, we're questioning the legality of it. But I mean, basically the company was on the ropes and failure was looking imminent. And a customer called in tears because her wedding dress hadn't arrived and she was getting married the next day. Mm-hmm. So there was a frontline service employee, and her name was Diane. We have not been able to find her last name.
If anybody out there knows it, please tell us.
We hate
telling Diane, please send us a message.
Female, service provider without having a last name. But she asked no one for permission, and essentially chartered a Cessna, a private plane, to make sure it got there in time. Mm-hmm. Now, this decision created so much buzz at the wedding that some senior executives who were attending as guests were so impressed that when they went home on Monday, they called a wobbly FedEx and hired them, and that lifeline, in retrospect, saved the company, and gave it the time and capital it needed to get its feet under itself. Now, it reflected this bleeding he called it bleeding purple, this culture that Fred Smith had built that had this, again, like get it done ethos, this like high standards, but also signaling that every single person on the team mattered. Mm-hmm. That they were seen, they were named, they were claimed, they were a critical part of the team, whoever you were in the hierarchy. And it was that culture that allowed this frontline employee to step up and
save the company.
Mm-hmm. Totally. And people felt giving people that autonomy to act also. I think that a lot of companies struggle to create that environment where a person would not only feel compelled to do it, but also be bold enough and know that they have the space to take an action like that.
And not be terrified.
Right. Yeah.
And not be terrified.
Yeah.
Not be terrified. This is really hard. So this is an amazing example of creating a culture that really enables people within the company thrive and take the company to the next level as a result. I love the story, and you included it in your book. It was one of the stories that definitely resonated with me. What a wonderful example. And are there any moments where people had to be really hard with their employees? So, to show that tough love or justice in a strict form that actually had really positive impact? Because I think when people think about tough love or this idea of justice, I think for many of us, it feels a little bit like an uncomfortable spot. And I think it's because we have this tendency to want to be nice rather than kind sometimes.
Netflix has a very interesting culture. Its culture is interesting because it's not for everyone, but it's super focused and super specific and really good for them. And they have these people that are innovators and mavericks, and you just need to stay out of their way. And if you get too much in their way, they'll be very sad. So their expense policy famously is act in Netflix best interest. Mm-hmm. The expense policy of every other organization is like dozens of pages long, with all kinds of caveats. But that wouldn't work at Netflix. So it's a very specific culture. They and Patty McCord has written about the culture, and Reed Hastings has written about the culture. But one of the things that really stands out is that if you get average performance, you'll get generous severance. Mm-hmm. So it is an organization that is just relentlessly high performance, and not everyone is on an upward trajectory. And there's no shame with it. In fact, they'll treat you with dignity on the way out, but you will be on your way out. Mm-hmm. And I really love the generous severance part.
Yes.
And so it seems like it has integrity all the way around. But I think this one, this is not touchy-feely.
Yes. And they talk about doing business and creating a healthy culture as like a sports team, which I think makes sense in the context, of course, that if someone is not performing up to your standards, they just need to leave, because the team is way more important than an individual. And as you say, it's not for everyone, for sure, but definitely works for Netflix. They've reinvented themselves a few times by now and are doing extremely well. So obviously there is a method to this madness. And I know also of another organization, the Zappos, right? And they had an amount that people could claim if they decided to quit after the first 6 months, I think. So there was always this possibility to opt out and, again, get some money so that you leave, actually, because you feel like Zappos is not the place for you, which I think is also great.
Yeah,
Because
a beautiful thing. And Anne and I we wrote our first book quite a while ago called Uncommon Service, and Zappos was one of the organizations we wrote about. And Tony Hsieh, may he rest in peace. Yeah. He was really a pioneer in many aspects of the culture. You know, the one that you mentioned, that everyone has to opt in, and they had to keep increasing the amount of money they would pay you to leave to make it a credible amount. And they didn't just offer it to the low performers; they offered it to everyone, which was a really quite exceptional thing. Yeah. Another thing about Zappos on their culture that really stood out to us is the way in which they treated their suppliers. So there's like legendary stories of how organizations with market power just beat up their suppliers. And Zappos had exactly the opposite view. They were like, everything we sell, someone else sells too. Everything. Yeah. So one way we can differentiate is if we extend our magnificent culture to suppliers. So they would go and pick suppliers up at the airport. They would treat them as well as they would treat any guest. They would have parades for them. Like the VIPs, if there was a VIP on site at Zappos, it was a supplier. And for sure, suppliers were not treated that way in any other company they went to. So of course, if there was a shortage, Zappos was the first one to receive the goods.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think this is a really nice segue to move to the second part of your book, which is around absence, because the stuff that we started talking about, which is culture and strategy, are part of how do you manage people, if we can use this word manage, maybe how do you lead people in your absence so that they can thrive in your absence as well. So tell me a little bit more about that. How do you set things up so that indeed when you are not there, and you've mentioned so many situations and scenarios where realistically you cannot be there with your people, so you need a great strategy, you need a great culture. Where do you start?
Yeah, so our sense is you start with the strategy, and the strategy, like if you're in an existing company, the strategy may be well defined, but it's likely not well understood. And so the first thing is how to get a deep understanding of the strategy throughout the whole organization. So Diane at FedEx had a deep understanding of the inner workings of FedEx, and she was able to take a decision. So you want to have the strategy. If it's, if the strategy is not right, fix it. But the real thing is, how do you communicate strategy so that everybody else can understand it? That's where we suggest you start. And here's why. If I'm away from leadership, there are two ways that the company has to ensure that I'm going to behave as well as possible. And that is my understanding of the strategy and my experience of the culture. That's it. And so our experience is that understand the strategy first, and everywhere where strategy is silent, culture has to fill in the gaps. So that the limits of strategy define the objective of culture. And so the sequence we find really matters.
Yeah. And One of the quotes that I recently posted from something that you both said was exactly that, how culture takes over whenever there is some level of ambiguity, and it basically drives people's decisions, even very banal ones like, do I need to be on time for this meeting? Or do I answer my client's email first? Or do I work on the report for my CEO first? What takes priority? Those sort of things. You cannot prescribe all of it. So culture is definitely that thing that is driving those decisions. And as you know, this is the Culture Lab podcast, right? So I cannot not, I cannot not ask this question. My goodness, how do you unlock the power of culture? How do you shape a culture that can really fill those blanks where strategy cannot prescribe and process and procedures cannot prescribe? What works in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we could talk about this for hours. So we are delighted to come on this podcast. We think of culture as the unspoken rules of engagement in an organization. The way things are really done around here, and as we've said before, it is the invisible force that guides behavior when the CEO or anyone else with formal authority isn't in the room. And it turns out, even in small organizations,
most of the time,
and now more than ever, it's most of the time. So it's easiest to see these concepts play out in big organizations because, as you said, the CEO of Microsoft, like Satya Nadella, is not going to even meet ever in his life, the majority of the people that he's trying to lead and trying to influence. And so all he has is strategy and culture. Now, when you're an entrepreneur in a small organization, you have all these other tools because people are in your presence. And yet these are still among your most powerful levers. So that's our starting place. And the first place we start is okay, what is the culture that we want to have? How can we be deliberate and not just default to our own assumptions, our own family experience, our own early influences of power and hierarchy?
My culture would have secret memos taped everywhere.
Or our reaction to those early influences.
Yeah.
What really makes sense for what we're trying to achieve? The thing about the Netflix story that is so powerful to me is the clarity.
Yes.
Right. The clarity with which, Patty McCord and Reed came together and said, these are the people we need to succeed. We're going to give them a name. We're going to call them innovator mavericks. And the thing that's super weird about these creatures is that they value freedom and autonomy above everything else in their lives. So if we want to attract these people and set them up to crush it, we have to be really deliberate about the culture that we bring them into. And this idea of freedom and autonomy really has to be at the center of it. And we have to thread it. The other beautiful part of the Netflix story is we're going to thread it through every single decision we make, down to how we write our expense policy.
Yeah.
So that really pushing people to reflect on what do you need for your organization to succeed, and how does that manifest from a culture standpoint, is a really important fire to walk through.
Yeah, totally. So really carefully designed, very intentional, and very well thought through, and integrated, woven into everything that you do, as you say.
And broadcast it. I mean,
broadcasted. Yeah.
This Netflix culture deck is among the most important artifacts to come out of Silicon Valley. And you just Google it. Yeah. Netflix culture deck. You get a 145 slide deck, which clarifies down to each of the cultural values and how they fit in with the strategy, and who fits and who doesn't, and they make it super clear who they want to walk through the door.
Yeah, you read that deck and you're like, I'm home, or oh my gosh, get me out of here.
Which is so great, because I think one of the things that can really make or break a company is what people you hire, right? And when you broadcast who you are and what you stand for in such a way, immediately, as you say, you attract the right people, or the people who wouldn't be the right fit, they say, yeah, this is not for me. I definitely can't see myself working in this organization. And it saves you so much trouble. So it's a fantastic tool to attract talent, the right kind of talent, and really being bold and brave about saying what sort of people you need to for your business to succeed. So I have a question around that, because I think, working with companies around their culture, I can see very often founders and founding teams struggle a little bit around this. So on one hand, of course, you think about what company you want to create, how you want to change the world, what dent do you want to make in the universe, and all those lofty ideals. On the other hand, you are who you are and you care about what you care. So there is this element of our cultural DNA that already exists. And my question to you is, have you seen any good examples where companies or leadership teams have reconciled those two things really well? Because I think one piece is around who you already are today. And the second piece is around who do we need to become so that we can bring our vision to life.
Yeah, so we most frequently come across this when companies are in trouble. So our phone rings disproportionately when a company has run into a rough patch. And so who they get confronted with is not sufficient.
Yeah.
And so then they want to go there. There's some that's not entirely the case, but it's the majority of the case, certainly over the last couple of years. And so what we often find is that who you are, who is a pretty significant shadow of the founder, and that we fell into some pretty common habits, which is we really like people who are really like us.
Yeah.
And what will have happened is some people who are not like us will have gotten into the company. Other names for that are diversity. And the folks that are different are not thriving as much as the folks that are similar. And that's a super common way that who we are needs to be different than who we're going to become. And what we can say is that this is a place where your intentions and instincts are wholly insufficient.
Totally.
There's no amount of good instincts and there's no amount of good intentions that are going to help you understand what people who are different than you need to thrive. And so we have to act very deliberately in a much more expansive way. And that tends to be a reckoning, well, over the last, certainly in 2020, that has been a reckoning for many, many organizations.
Yeah.
And again, it comes down to as simple as you can see who's thriving now because it's everyone who's really like us. And we're sad because the limits that has on innovation and excellence. And maybe we're starting to get, our lunch eaten by other people who have more lived experiences and can contribute greater ways.
Yeah, totally. And since we are talking about who we are can stand in the way to success and being able to make the right impact on the world, I want to talk a little bit about the companies that you've worked with, like Uber, WeWork, Riot Games, because for many people, eventually they came to symbolize everything wrong with the Silicon Valley, basically. So I want to ask, what was your experience trying to help them transform their culture, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, and so the first one started with Uber and it's when Anne and I made the decision, and Anne and I worked on it together, but I was the one who commuted every week from Cambridge to San Francisco and took a leave from Harvard. But we consciously made the decision that if we can help companies that are in a lot of trouble and we can help them turn around, we are giving a prescription and a roadmap and permission for anyone who's got it less severely to get better. Yeah. So we went to these organizations precisely because there were problems. Now we're at this point pretty good at helping companies, so we have a great responsibility to make sure that these are good people in these companies, because the damage we could do is go to a company in trouble because it's got, loads and loads of evil people. And then if we help them, that will make us sad.
Mm-hmm.
So what we do in our due diligence are the vast majority of the people good? They have gotten caught in some behaviors, like at Uber, for example. Almost all of the problems at Uber were due to the fact that a manager inflicted something on one of their direct reports. Well, no one at Uber had been trained how to manage, and everyone at Uber was in their first job.
Mm-hmm.
They got hired as an individual contributor. 5 minutes later, because of hypergrowth, they were put in the position of a manager. 5 minutes after that, the manager of a manager.
Mm-hmm.
And no one ever taught them how to do it. So when we went out there, what's very clear in our mind is that leadership and management can be taught from a,
Yes.
we very much believe in it. And we found, and this is the part that's really incredible, Uber's culture, we were able to contribute to it turning around within 9 months. We separated from 20 people out of 13,000 in June of 2017. And so that culture was just devastated. And it was turned around with the vast majority of the same people. And that's our experience. If you go to Riot, if you go to WeWork, it's similar percentages. And so we go there so that we can, learn the secret memos. We only help good people trying to do noble things. And then the agreement we make is that we're going to open source it so that everyone else can learn from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of the patterns across young founder-led companies in our experience, like Uber, like Riot Games, in some ways, if we take a step back from the individuals, which I think sometimes is hard for the press to do, the story of, anyway, I think it's a lot of it is about the cultural growing pains of moving from a small, relatively homogenous, fast-moving, high-growth organization into an organization that has much greater accountability and responsibility to a much larger number of people, including the employees showing up. And so I'll give you an example from Uber that we write about. But one of the cultural values was always be hustling. Now, that makes a ton of sense when you look at the founder's ride to success. He was hustling his whole life. It made a ton of sense for a young, scrappy organization to put that on a poster and tack it to the wall and say, go be scrappy. Yeah. Now, when you're an organization of thousands of people touching millions of riders, always be hustling doesn't make sense for every function in the organization. For example, compliance with international law. That is not a function where you should be hustling. That's a function where you need to get it right. And so there comes a point in the evolution of a company, and we think it's earlier than most companies should do it. We think companies need to do this on a much more regular basis, is do a cultural audit. Do the assumptions that we're making still make sense? Are the values that we are celebrating, first of all, have they become weaponized? Are we using them against each other or our stakeholders? And we see that frequently. But do they even make sense? Do they even make sense given where we are as an organization and our level of maturity as a company, even from a strategy point of view?
Yeah, totally. And it's probably quite a difficult thing to do, right? Because when you start out like Uber, and actually they did put huge emphasis on their values. Kalanick put a huge emphasis on the values, and then suddenly you need to reconsider and change. And actually, you were part of that process. So I'm curious, what is it like when people have been almost indoctrinated to believe in those things and operate in alignment with those things, and then suddenly you take a turn and you introduce a new set of values? What was the reaction there?
Yeah, so I think the way in which you do it matters. And we both, we really love mission-driven companies. We love companies that have strong values. And we realize that values need to be updated, and we're trying to help organizations do it before they become weaponized. But what you can think is that we have a collection of values and they're suboptimizing. And so we're going to optimize them. We're going to make them better. And if you do it, the first values probably got handed on from up high.
Yeah.
The revision of them should not be. The revision of them should involve every person in the organization that wants to be involved. And we have learned ways to do this. You can do it no matter what size the organization in, 30 to 60 days. But you want to get broad involvement with people, and in their involvement of what about the existing values is just super precious to you? And what about the existing values is the intention good, but the practice unfortunate? And if you let everyone participate in that stage, what we have found is that you usually keep about 70% of the values, but the new values are of the organization. And so you actually get a recommitment just as strong, perhaps even stronger, because there's more people behind it. So there is a beautiful thing in the reconceptualizing of the values. And as Anne said, the rate of change right now, internally and externally, is so high that if an organization has not looked at their values in the last 5 years, we just have no hesitation in saying we would recommend you do this exercise.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing we also experience is there's often a lot of relief.
Yes.
Because I think there are a lot of people showing up day after day and they know something's wrong and they experience it and they observe it for people that they care about. And people are really hungry to solve the problem. And I think, surprising to everyone at the top, and often observers from the outside, is that 70% number. Because at the beginning of this journey, they're afraid everything's going to go. They think they have to throw everything out. And typically it's about, as Frances said, recommitting to the values that will continue to serve you. Eliminating the ones that don't and bringing on new ones that are important to wherever the organization is and the people who are showing up and the people you want to show up. And that's a really optimistic journey.
It's a super optimistic
for most
journey.
Organizations. Yeah.
It's terrifying for the senior leaders, as Anne says, and particularly because they won't be very good guessers on what's in the 70 and what's in the 30.
Right.
Yeah.
And so you have to have faith in the organization. But the truth is the values are for the organization.
Yes. Yes. So true. And I love this process. And I know that it's super important from personal experience as well to engage the organization because, as you say, leaders very often have blind spots, but also you really want to have the buy-in and tap into what's working and what's not working, and also what people feel is going to take them where they need to go in this next stage of organization's development. So it makes total sense to me. My goodness, where do we go next? I mean, I definitely would love to know what it's like thinking, selfishly, but also about our listeners. Some of them are entrepreneurs and maybe are considering working with their family members, spouses, etc., etc. So tell us about that. What are the key challenges? Because you seem to be so in sync and working so well together. So what is the secret sauce of a successful collaboration with a spouse or a family member?
I love this line of questioning because we have never thought about it.
Yeah.
I mean, we not in a structured way. I think the headline is we definitely recommend it.
Uh-huh.
I think
it makes our marriage better.
Yes.
Really?
I think.
In what ways?
Our marriage thrives when we're solving hard problems together. Mm-hmm. And it gets us out of being at all narcissistic, and we're in service of something greater. And I have so much admiration for Anne, and I get to see it on a daily basis as we're working on hard things, and I get to marvel at what she did. So we call this Scooby snacks, but when we give one another positive reinforcement. Well, when we're working together, I have cause to give positive reinforcement and to receive positive reinforcement on a practically daily basis. And it's for things that are like really important, like trying to get the secret memos out to the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's almost like some people have described in this work from home revolution that we're all living through. that they get to see a different side of their spouse, and while they watch them work, from the kitchen table, and we've been seeing that for a long time, and it's so nourishing.
And
I'm sold already, but keep going.
The other thing that helps is that we are very much in sync, but we have super complementary skills.
Yeah.
Super complementary.
So what are your superpowers, Frances? And then I'll ask the same to Anne.
Well, I'm a great editor. I'm terrible with a blank sheet of paper.
Right.
But I'm a great reader and a great editor, and I'm fearless in going out and practicing any ideas that Anne comes up with. What are your superpowers, Anne?
You're a wonderful muse, baby. Yeah, I mean, I do think it helps that we are very clear about each other's strengths. And so we do have lanes that we respect.
Yeah.
So, Frances is incredible at the front of a room. She's an amazing educator. It is just her frame on the world is, let me understand something so that I can teach it to others. That is your driving force at all times. I think my profile is more kind of artist entrepreneur. And I like to create things. I like to make things. I love language. I think we are both equally motivated by this idea of helping people realize their potential. I think your preferred modality is a classroom, and mine is probably a one-on-one kind of coaching dynamic, which is something I really, really love to do. But what's fun is to bring each other into those domains.
To visit, only to visit.
I love, we do a lot of coaching as part of the work we do with companies. It's just, one piece of the engagement.
Yeah.
But there's nothing I enjoy more than bringing Frances into those conversations, particularly if there's someone I'm trying to reach and I know I'm having trouble getting there. And then it's super fun to come into her classroom sandbox and play
And then, what you said in the beginning about the book, which I do think is a beautiful book, and I do think it's elegant in framing, and Anne is a beautiful writer. And I used to think that beautiful writers, they just must write great first drafts. And that's not it.
No.
It's, 10, 11, 12 drafts. And so when Anne writes something and I read it, I'm like, oh my God, that's perfect. Pour liquid cement on it. She's like, no. We're going to tear it down.
Laminate.
And each time I'm like, oh my God, that's perfect. Don't touch it.
Yeah.
But there's an analog on the teaching side too. I mean, some of your colleagues, I don't say dismiss, but we'll say, Frances can teach the phone book, right?
But you're doing this for the 100th time. I'm tearing it down for the 100th time.
And I get to witness that process and back to where we started. And it's really nourishing to the relationship.
Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with Esther Perel and her work. She is.
Anne is beaming.
I'm a super fan.
Oh my God, me too. And
not me.
It speaks to our differences. Frances is mad.
Business,
we cannot see each other, so I don't know if they're beaming or not. Hence, we have this conversation.
Difference. And pro, me, no.
Okay, got you. But the thing that you said about how important it is and how it nourishes your relationship when you can see each other doing what you are best at. She talks about this a lot as well.
Yeah.
So she says how important it is to see your loved one, your spouse, your lover, being out in the world and doing what they're best at, because it's very erotic, very engaging. And I can totally see that. And I think for a lot of people, they might have had this experience during the pandemic as well, or maybe the opposite as well. I don't know, because I'm curious. Listeners, if you are listening to this and you have something to say on the topic of what were your experiences witnessing your partners working at home, let us know. I'm really curious about this. Thank you for sharing this. This is amazing. I'm definitely sold on the idea of working with my husband. He's quite hesitant, but I think that I'll get him there at some point. Okay, so
the other advice would be to find a way to talk about it, right? To talk about, to check in with each other and discuss what's working and what's not working.
And Scooby snacks are key.
Yes.
Scooby snacks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, everything that you have said is, I think, equally true for non-family or non-personal relationships, partnerships as well. I can't think of.
I mean, sometimes that founder relationship is as intimate,
at least as intimate
as a marriage. So I think it totally applies.
Yeah. So we have this section in the podcast that is called Rapid Fire Questions. And I have 5 questions. And the idea is that you'll try to answer them in under 2 minutes. Right. So are we good to go?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let's do it. So first question, how do you define organizational culture? You have talked a little bit about this, but give us your definition again.
Yes. The simplest definition, I think, is the unspoken rules of engagement. The more complicated version is it's the invisible force that guides behavior when the CEO or anyone else with formal authority isn't in the room. And it turns out those people are not in the room most of the time.
And what are the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
Means and standard deviations. So low means, you have low engagement in the company as an example, or standard deviations, there are demographic tendencies associated with who's thriving.
What company do you admire for the culture and why?
We are big admirers of Microsoft. So the culture was really at the center of its recent turnaround, and diversity and inclusion is at the center of culture. Kathleen Hogan, Chief People Officer, and CEO Satya Nadella really partnered to not only elevate inclusion as a strategic priority, but to make sure that this idea of a growth mindset was really disseminated to everyone in the organization.
Yeah, I love them as well. What books on culture or on leadership, or perhaps even outside of the sphere of business books, would you recommend to our listeners? Because they are looking for something that will give them an inspiration around how to cultivate a great culture. And it might not necessarily be a business book. I know that you read a lot of philosophy, so perhaps.
Yeah, we'll give you 3. So one is The Fearless Organization by Amy Edmondson, which really talks about the importance of psychological safety in a culture, among other things, to make sure companies are thriving. Another book is coming out this spring. Another colleague of ours, Sadal Neely, has written a book called The Remote Work Revolution. So what does culture look like now when we're all working from anywhere? Really interesting questions. Super practical. And my last endorsement is actually a television show, if you'll indulge me, called Ted Lasso. You can find it on Apple TV. It's a comedy. It's about an American football coach who shows up in this very cynical culture of British football. So, we call it soccer. But it really showcases the power of a single individual to change things, and culture is at the center of the storyline.
Oh, I love it. And I've never heard of this show. So definitely going to check it out. So finally, what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
The one thing is you're making a decision between should I change a little or change a lot? And we would say fearlessly go towards change a lot.
Awesome. Do you have any closing remarks, something that you'd like us to end on?
Yeah, our final thought is to simply begin. The journey towards culture change can start at any moment, and our advice is to start right now. The chance that you are underestimating the cost of standing still is very, very high. That it is inaction in a context where to Francis's point that not everyone has equal access to thriving is not only, we would argue, immoral on some levels, but it's also incredibly risky from a strategic standpoint. Those human assets that will determine everything are very likely to walk out the door.
Yeah, totally. And I know that we haven't really had an opportunity to elaborate on that topic. So I'm curious whether you have any recommendations for our listeners where they can find more about how to create an environment that minimizes bias and that allows everyone to thrive. What are the best resources? Because it is so hard. And I know that for a lot of our listeners, they have the best intentions, but it's difficult. It's difficult to do it right. So we don't have time to talk about this in detail, but perhaps you have something to recommend in terms of resource.
I'll give, for self-serving, the chapter on belonging in our book, and in particular, something that we call the inclusion dial, goes after this directly. Another place to go and look is a book written by Francesca Gino called Rebel Talent. And then what most of your listeners are probably familiar with, but it's worth revisiting, is going to Mahzarine Banaji's website on Mindbugs. And she is the person, the same way that Amy Edmondson, the person who brought us psychological safety, Mahzarine Banaji brought us unconscious bias. But if you go back to the source, as opposed to other people interpreting the source, it's a really nourishing act.
Thank you so much. And we're going to put everything in the show notes. And what are the best places for our listeners to follow you, learn more about your work, or connect with you online?
I have slow twitch muscle. So for me, it's LinkedIn.
I'm with you. Not a Twitter person.
You can find me on Twitter.
Fastly.
A little bit faster twitch. We also have a website for the book, which is theleadersguide.com. And we're delighted. We're delighted. You can find us both on LinkedIn. And we are delighted to engage with anyone.
To engage.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It was delightful to have you as guests on the Culture Lab. And I'm sure that our listeners will love what you have shared. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was our selfish pleasure.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast. And this is the Culture Lab team.
Production Manager, Lindsay Nunez.
Art Director, Emily Spencer.
Aaron Scott, Content Editor.
Sound Producer, James Eade, Be Heard.
If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and many other places where podcasts are available. If you'd like to subscribe to my newsletter, The Culture Lab Insider, go to www.agabayer.com/podcast and scroll down to the very bottom of the page. That's www.agabayer.com/podcast. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to it. Before I give you a sneak peek into the next episode, here is a quick reminder. This episode is brought to you by the Culture Strategy Bootcamp, a virtual bootcamp that helps you create a thriving culture at scale. If you are a leader in a company that grows, and if you want to start turning your strategy and your culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth, definitely check this out. Applications for this edition of the bootcamp are now closed, but you can subscribe for updates about the fall edition right here. bit.ly/culture-bootcamp. That's bit.ly/culture-bootcamp. And now a quick preview of the next episode. This time I'm bringing you a colleague and a new thinking partner of mine, a fellow culture practitioner, Brett Potter. Brett is an outstanding professional and a generous human being. He helps companies build and develop strong, functional company cultures. He's the CEO of Culture Gene, a culture leadership platform that helps high-growth companies work on their culture. His second book, Own Your Culture, How to Define, Embed, and Manage Your Company Culture, was published in September 2020. And in this soundbite, you will hear Brett talk about his experience with what running a recruitment process based on values fit on behalf of his client felt like.
being told these are our values and we wanted you to find people who match these values made it a much more more difficult search. But actually, when it got to the interview stage, that was where the light bulb went on for me. Is the interviews just ran that much smoother. In one case, the successful candidate and the CEO, when they were talking, it was almost as if they had been dancing tango for 10 years. They finished one another's sentences. It was just different. And actually, the impact that the candidates had on those companies after those searches was so significant that I realized this is the missing link.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Culture Lamp. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.